Hi. This is the new SP-404 MK2, a substantial upgrade to the classic SP-404, with major improvements on almost every front, including a high-res screen, 4 more pads per bank, more voices, more effects, RGB velocity-sensitive pads, (16 gigs of internal storage, and much more. It's a sampler, a sample player, a sample sequencer, a beat maker, a mini DJ deck, and an effects box all combined in one. This video has 3 parts: a tutorial going through the main workflow of this instrument, then a tips and tricks section to help you get more out of it, and finally a pros and cons section in light of the alternatives available on the market today. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Roland sent this SP over for review, but as always they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and store affiliate links in the description which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Let's start with an overview of the main things the SP-404 MK2 can do. Like I mentioned, it's a sampler. It has 2 1/4-inch inputs in the back and a mic and instrument input up front with a switch to choose between the 2 and adjustable gain. Pretty much the only thing that this doesn't have that the original SP had is a built-in microphone. Aside from being able to sample audio, it's also a sample player. It can store up to 16 gigabytes of one-shots, loops, stems, and even whole tracks up to 16 minutes long per sample, which would take about 180 megabytes for 16 minutes, all streaming from the internal memory. If you need more than 16 gigabytes of projects on the go, you can store them on an SD card, optional, not included, or move them back and forth to a computer using a companion app. You can store up to 16 projects on board. It takes a few seconds to move between project to project, but once you've loaded up a project, you have immediate access to 160 samples, 16 samples per bank, banks A through E. Don't blink when you press them once. When you press them again, you have access to the secondary banks. Again, 16 samples per blinking bank. So for example, in this project, I've included samples from my Superbooth sample pack. This is the Buchla, and this bank is the 6mod 6606. This is the Erica Synths Percons. Now you can't store multi-sample packs here, but you can select a pad and then play it chromatically, monophonically, but later on I'll show you a trick to play samples chromatically, polyphonically. Anyway, as you can hear, moving between the banks is very quick, but let's say if I wanted to load up a different project, so let's say I've got my albums here, it takes a few seconds to swap projects. The SP has 16 velocity sensitive pads, and this one is also velocity sensitive. It'll repeat the last sample you played. You can also assign this to a different function. Aside from being a sample player, the SP is also a sample sequencer. If we enter the pattern sequencer, it can store up to 16 patterns per bank, again, across 10 banks. So you could launch a pattern and then queue up another pattern, which will start playing the minute the first pattern ends, 4 bars in this case. You can, at least currently, only play 1 pattern at a time. I'll show you a workaround for that in the tips and tricks section as well. Moving on with things the SP-404 MK2 can do, it can also be an effects machine. It has 37 internal effects and 16 input effects that can be applied to external audio, and you can combine the input effects with the internal effects. I'll talk about the effects in detail later, but basically you've got 5 shortcut buttons that you can configure. They've got pre-assigned effects you can apply, 3 knobs to control effect parameters. Occasionally you'll have more than 3 parameters. You can press the value knob to see additional parameters. And then the input effects are available as a shift menu here. We'll talk about these later on in the effects section. The final major thing the MK2 can do is be a simplified DJ machine. Hit these two buttons to enter DJ mode. In DJ mode, the pads now function as per the backlit labels here, not the shift functions here. You've got control of two decks with these two columns. More on all of this in detail later on. Overall, things on the Mark II are very immediately accessible. There are only a few obscure shortcuts. I'll talk about that later as well. Let's take a look at connectivity. There are 3 ways to power the SP-404 Mark II. 6 AA batteries should last you between 2.5 and 3.5 hours, depending on whether you use rechargeable ones or not. You can use a power supply that comes with the unit, and you can also power it over USB-C if you can give it enough juice. On the front are headphone jacks in both sizes, which can be used as a separate Q mix. On the back, a USB-C port, not just for power, but also both MIDI and audio. So you can use this as an audio interface with 2 channels in, including all the input effects, and 4 channels out, a pair through the 1/4-inch outputs and 2 channels through the headphone output. Finally, on the back are 2 TRS mini jacks for MIDI in and out, dongles not included. This does send and receive MIDI notes, and clock if you want to sync it up with other gear. Okay, let's dive into the details. We'll start with sample playback. The number you see here, by the way, as I press the samples, is the preset tempo for each sample. You don't have to follow the BPM of the project if you don't want to. Just disable that. To see the sample waveforms, you need to go into Sample Edit. I think it would be nice if they had that on all the time instead of these numbers, which over time aren't that useful. Anyway, if you don't want the pads to be velocity sensitive, you can change them to fixed velocity. There's also a 16 velocity mode where the pads will play the sample you selected at different velocities regardless of how hard you press. And then if we pick a transposable sample, then if we go into chromatic mode, it will pitch it up and down. So you can play chromatically with samples. You can also shift the view up and down to an octave down or up. Like I mentioned earlier, this is monophonic, so only one note at a time. It doesn't support scales in the current firmware or polyphony, but like I said, I'll show you a way around both those limitations in the tips and tricks section. A few other playback options. Gate determines whether the sample just plays as a one-shot when you press it, and you can stop it like that, or turn on gate mode, and it will only play for as long as you hold the pad, or if you use the hold button. Loop will loop the sample, and you can set loop points if you like. So let's say if you want just this section to loop, you can play a sample in reverse or ping pong, so back and forth. From loop to start. 4 taps on exit, by the way, stop all the audio. Then you've got envelope controls for samples. So a sample will typically just play start to finish at the maximum level of the sample. But if you hit shift envelope, then you can set a slow attack to bring the sound gradually in, and a slow release, as well as a hold time for the total length of the sample. Now, unfortunately, as of the current firmware, it doesn't take into consideration the gate feature. So let's say that I have a release and hold, the sample playback will always be fixed. And if I leave the button, the release will be immediate, as opposed to a gradual release. If I keep it held, hopefully they'll add an attack sustain release envelope as a firmware update. Let's take a look at a few other playback related features. You can link pads. So say if I wanted these 2 pads to trigger together, just hit shift pad link, and then you have up to 10 groups of pads that you can link. And now these will trigger regardless of which of the 2 you press. Then you also have mute groups. So say if I wanted this closed hat to mute this open hat, hit mute groups, put them in a group, and they will now choke each other. Let's move on. Roll is a note repeat function. So you set a rate on a per pad basis, by the way. So let's say I set a roll rate, of 16ths for this, and maybe every 4th for the kick. And you can have up to 4 of these run at the same time. On linked pads, by the way, rolls only work for the pad you press, at least currently. And there's also a nifty feature. You can temporarily change the roll rate by turning the value knob. The pads, by the way, are velocity sensitive, but not pressure sensitive as of the current firmware. So if I hit a pad softly, the roll will play softly. If I hit it harder, it'll play harder, but it's not pressure sensitive, at least not in the current firmware. I asked Roland about this, and they said that if there's enough demand, they could make rolls respond to pressure. Let's move on and talk about pitch and speed. So you enter that using this button. Now there are a few options here. First, volume, if you like, for a specific pad, and with shift, also panning. Anyway, the more important pitch and speed options are whether you're in vinyl mode or not. So in vinyl mode, changing the speed of the sample will pitch it up, kind of like a record. And you can BPM sync a sample to the project tempo this way. It'll just pitch up and down as the project tempo changes. So that's vinyl mode and a lot of fun. But if you want, you can also time stretch and pitch shift a sample, meaning keep it playing at the same rate, only at a different pitch, or have it maintain its pitch as it plays faster or slower. This is always a challenge for hardware. Anyway, if you hit shift and turn this knob, you get out of vinyl mode and move into time stretch and pitch shift. So let's hear the original sample. Speeding samples up typically isn't an issue while maintaining the pitch, which is cool. So it does this fairly well, about 10 to 15%. Then it starts getting granular. Same for slowing it down. So, around 10%, it sounds good. But the more you slow it down, the more granular it gets. Same thing for pitch shift, while maintaining the tempo. So again, the shorter the semitone distance, the less ridiculous it sounds. Cool. Okay, let's move on and talk about audio effects. In the SP-404, effects live in a few different places. There's one effects slot on the inputs, and then 4 effects slot or buses on the main mix. So the first easy to understand and fairly straightforward effects option are the effects on the input bus. Let's forego bypass.
Show was more spread out this year.
Auto pitch.
One thing didn't change. Multiple.
Makes me sound evil. You can edit the effects parameters here. So
you won't be able to buy or play many of these synths or drum machines for a while
until they're released.
But I have you covered. I stopped
okay,
with the
let's
most
move on.
interesting ones and create a
Vocoder.
mega sample pack with more than 10 synths and drum machines with multi-samples and dozens of presets for the synths and multiple kits from the drum machines and other interesting
And
noise
then,
makers. To make things interesting, I reached
guitar
out to a
amp
few
synth.
companies that make quite desirable
Chorus.
instruments, and here's what they've agreed to contribute as prizes.
Juno Chorus.
Native Instruments threw in a Machine Plus, their flagship standalone hardware production and performance instrument, one license to Complete 13 Ultimate and a license to Complete 13, both massive collections of sampled instruments, virtual synths, effects, and sound libraries. Soma Labs agreed to send out 2 of their flagship organismic Lyra 8s at a color of your choice, and 1 Cosmos.
Arturia threw in a KeyStep Pro, the most compact and powerful keyboard controller for synth and drum machine setups. and 2 copies of their V Collection 8, a massive collection of virtual synth and so those are the input effects, and you can also sample with the input effects as well. Most of these effects are available as bus effects, but some aren't. The auto pitch, vocoder, and guitar amp sim are only available on the inputs, whether on the front or back. So those are the input effects, and then there are the effects you'll probably use more often, the bus effects, and you have a choice of 37 effects to pick from, 5 directly accessible on the top panel, and another 32 you can choose from by pressing the MFX button and then selecting one of 32 effects, which you can scroll through like this, but also make a quick selection for the top 16 effects using these buttons, then the bottom 16 effects by holding these 2 together. So the selected effect now gets assigned to the MFX button. And then these are obviously quickly accessible. Filter and drive. Don't forget that the arrows here mean that there are additional parameters that are available. By the way, if you hold remain and the effect, it'll stick around. Anyway, additional parameters available when you press this button. So for example, I could choose a high pass filter type. And yeah, additional parameters. Anyway, that's the filter / drive. Then there's the resonator. Again, you can expose additional parameters using the value button. It's better to find the scale of your song with a resonator. Anyway, delays, an isolator, DJFX looper, different repeat rates, and like I mentioned, you can customize these. I won't go through all the parameters of all the effects, but let's just taste a bit of each. Okay, tape echo, time control delay, plenty of lo-fi. Each of these has, of course, between 3 to 6 parameters. Again, remain, and the button will keep this on the screen. Yeah, tape got stuck there. So lo-fi. And again, 16 more by holding this. Reverb, chorus, Juno chorus, flanger, phaser, each with their parameters, of course. Slicer is cool, panning, tremolo, chromatic pitch shifter, nice one. Cool. Hyper resonator, ring mod, bit crusher, drive, distortion, equalizer, EQ, and of course compressor. So those are the effects, and they're a ton of fun. Where it gets a little bit complicated is that you have 4 slots for these effects. So as you noticed when I was swapping these, one instance of an effect replaced the other one. There are, however, up to 4 instances you can play around with of these effects. 2 bus effects, bus 1 and bus 2. You can send any of the pads to bus 1 and any of the pads to bus 2, or bypass all the effects. And then if I hit effects settings, you get a map of the 2 additional bus slots, bus 3 and bus 4. 3 and 4 are always applied at the end of the chain. regardless of what you choose for 1 and 2. And then bus 1 and 2 have 2 possible routings, either independent in parallel or bus 1 feeding into bus 2. So let's see how this would work on a kit. So for example, let's say that I wanted to choose the delay for bus 2. Okay, sync delay for bus 2. And then maybe let's go for filter and drive for bus 1. Now let's take a look at the current routing. Right now, bus 1 is feeding into bus 2. So the drive is being fed into the delay. If I change the routing to parallel, then we only get the drive and none of the delay because we're not routing any of the pads to bus 2. The way you route pads to the different buses is by using the remain button, which also shows you how much available storage you have. Anyway, you can customize these colors. I set it to sort of this yellowish orange for bus 1. So now this pad is being fed into the drive. If I tap it once, it goes to blue, which is bus 2, my sync delay. So now we're getting a delay, but no drive because the buses are in parallel. If I wanted to add a drive after this delay, I could do it in the effects settings, either by changing the routing and changing the bus here, or by adding effects to buses 3 and 4. Buses 3 and 4 work in pairs, and you have 16 preset pairs. And you can customize what's in every slot. So for example, here I've got bypass in bus 3 and compressor in bus 4. Just move to the bus 3 tab, and then I could customize this to say, let's go for 303 vinyl simulator. And if I head back to the main routing screen, you'll see bus 3 now has the 303 vinyl sim. So it takes a bit of getting used to. Let's turn off buses 3 and 4. Again, just choose the bus you want to route to, swap buses here, and then hit remain to route a pad. So again, if I wanted to route this back to bus 1, I'd go to bus 1, hit remain, tap here, it'll change color, and now it's got the drive. If you change it, by the way, to white, then it just bypasses all the buses, all the effects. Now, if you understood the effects, you probably understood the most complex thing about this. Everything else is fairly simple. One important thing to remember about the effects, the sends are stored with the project. Everything, by the way, everything you change here is saved immediately with the project. But your choice of effects, the 4 effects you choose for each of the buses, that's global, not just to the bank, not just to the project, but to the entire state of the machine, and it isn't saved when you shut down. So if you rely on intricate routings for specific pads, send a bunch of pads to this effect and a bunch of pads to that effect, you'll need to remember that as you swap projects, or save it in the favorites. That's the only thing that does get saved as a machine state when you shut down the machine. But again, even that is global. And like I mentioned, you have 16 favorites for bus 3 and 4. Okay, let's move on and talk about sampling. Luckily, sampling and resampling is very easy and fast. The two are very similar. Sampling here is capturing audio from the external sources with or without the input effects. And resampling also lets you capture the audio that's playing back on the SP if you like. Unlike the original SP, by the way, this samples all the pads, all the effects, regardless of how many you play. So to sample, you just hit record. You need to find an empty pad, which there aren't many of in this project. Empty pads will blink. Choose the pad. And then there are a few settings for sampling wait. We'll just wait for the audio to pass a certain threshold.
Virtual synths, effects, and sound library.
And you hit
Soma Labs agreed to send out
play and it will record.
Organismic Lyra 8s at a color of your choice.
And then when you're ready to stop, just hit record and you can stop monitoring the external source here. And then you basically
Virtual synths, effects,
have a sample. I know it's difficult to hear me talk over myself, but we can easily take this into max headroom territory. There are a few functions you can apply to samples. You can normalize them.
Virtual synth.
And set start and end points. You can easily make a Twin Peaks edition. Okay. And if I wanted to truncate this magnificent sample, I could as well. Emphasis, by the way, I think is emphasizing the higher frequencies. Anyway, just hit truncate and we get this. There are a few more options here. Count in, like you saw before, can be either one measure, no count in, or two measures. Here we are. Or wait, like I mentioned before, that just waits for audio to pass a certain threshold. You can determine that threshold, by the way, in the settings with Shift Utility. And then there are a few other recording or sampling settings. If you hit record and hit record settings, you'll be able to see them. You can record with a metronome, with a click, and this lets you set the tempo for the click. You don't have to use this, but you can, and that will also set the tempo for the sample, though you can analyze the sample and have it auto-detect. Routing chooses whether you take the input from the external input or from the mix, which in the case of sampling, remember, which is recording only external audio, means also these effects. Then there's level and panning. Shift always helps you discover more features, and input effects to apply input effects to the external audio. And then resampling is just like recording, only it applies to everything you do with the SP-404 MK2. So for example, let's say that I wanted to resample myself, noodling with some effects over this loop. Just hit resample, choose an empty pad. This one, hit a pad, start noodling. Then again, hit record to stop, and then this is my resample effectively baking in the isolator automation. So yeah, cool stuff. You can then go ahead and edit the audio any way you like. Let's say if you go back to this sample, a few more things about editing samples. You can zoom in using the value encoder, or zoom in around the start loop or end point by holding Shift and turning this knob. You could move it extremely precisely and then zoom back in and out. A fun feature, roll will play the last 3 seconds of the sample. So you don't have to listen. If you want to find your endpoint, you don't have to listen to the whole thing. Just listen to the last few seconds by hitting roll. Generally, if a button is blinking, it means that it can do something. For example, the, where was I? Remain button here will make sure that the start location doesn't move beyond the loop point. Otherwise, it'll push it around. Anyway, a button blinking is a hint that it does something. Another fun sampling option, if you have a log sample and want to chop it up, enter chop mode, and this works in a number of ways very easily. Either play the sample and choose your chop points, and you can then assign these chops to pads, and let's go look for empty pads in this project. Yeah, let's say put them 1, 2, 3, 4. Easy as that. And yeah, now we have a chopped up sample. And yeah, let's go back to it. Here we are. So other chop options. Yeah, maybe 3 taps would be enough here. Anyway, other chop options. You can move the cursor around and just mark chop points like that. And then go ahead and move those around, or choose a different mark, different chop point, and do it that way. And you also have a very nice auto mark mode, which will either do this based on equal time divisions, level, or transients, and there are a few options here. So we go for medium. Okay, so we have the joy of sampling something and then chopping it up. Okay, so that is sampling and chopping. Let's talk about sequencing. Like I mentioned earlier, each bank has 16 sequences, and you can preview them by going into Pattern Select, then just tap Patterns to start playing them back. And creating your own sequences is fairly easy. Okay, we heard that. So you just need to find an empty spot, or you can add notes to an existing sequence. Let's start with an empty one, and this project's pretty full. These are empty. Anyway, hit record, and choose an empty sequence. Then there are a few settings here. Tempo, obviously. The length of the sequence in bars. For some reason, there's only this geometric series of numbers, so you can't pick, say, 3 or 6 or 5 bars. Hopefully it'll change that. And then there are a few grid options, including triplet options and shuffle, that you can choose to quantize to or not based on the quantize strength. Yeah, just hit record. And you can sequence any of the samples in the project from any of the banks, not just the bank where this pattern exists. There's no step sequencer. You can just play live into the sequence. But if you notice these squares fill up, there is an undo. So if we go back, we can undo what we did and program things back in. So, and yeah, another way to erase stuff if you've outdone your undo buffer is just hit delete. Then you hold the pad you want to erase, kind of like an erase head throughout the entire pattern. And there's no quick erase for a specific pad, but that's pretty much it. Like I mentioned, there's no step sequencing. And when you're done sequencing, just hit record. Unlike sampling, you can overdub. So just select an existing pad. All these are empty. This isn't, but I could still choose to add to my pattern. And yeah, hit record with or without a countdown, by the way. Those are our kicks. What else have we got here? There are a few ways to edit a pattern by hitting pattern edit. This is a 1-bar pattern, so nothing to write home about here. But if we say go to this one or this one, and then hit pattern edit, let's say choose this guy. So this pattern is 4 bars long. You can't change the start point unless you make it shorter. So let's do that. Then you can move the selection area around. And then there are a few functions that you can apply to this. You can duplicate this part, crop. And that's pretty much what you have in terms of loop editing and sequencing. I guess one more thing is that you can hit record again and you're in rehearsal mode. So you can practice and then hit record. And here we go. Now you can also resample a pattern into a sample. So let's go into pattern select and then choose this guy, hit resample. Now I need to choose an empty pad that I want to resample into. So let's say this one is empty in this bank, and then let's go for this. So now it's recording this pattern into a sample. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a way to stop recording at the end of the pattern. You've got to time your press right, or of course, go and edit this once it's a sample. It would be nice, however, if you could have the timing be perfectly quantized to the length of a loop or maybe a bar. A few more things about patterns. You can chain patterns. You use the hold button for this. There are 16 chains in total, 16 chain slots. You pick one and then you choose the patterns that you want to sequence in that chain. So that's nice if you want to create songs. Another important feature that I want to talk about is skip back. It turns out that, like the government, the SP-404 MK2 is constantly listening and recording everything that's going on in a 25-second buffer every time audio passes above a certain threshold. So let's say that I was noodling, playing around with a pattern or a melody, and I suddenly played something totally original that I wanted to keep, and I didn't hit record, I didn't sample this. You can see the mark button blinking here with excitement. This means that it stored something in the buffer. You hit mark, and you get the buffer. You can treat it like a sample, normalize it, and you hit subpad to play it. And yeah, it's kind of like a time machine for good ideas. The last important feature I want to talk about in the SP-404 MK2 is its DJ mode. Loading up entire tracks, your albums, anything you want into this is super easy. I mean, you could sample or use the SD card, but frankly, the easiest way is just to drag all the tracks into one of the banks. Let's just drop it in here. I'll speed this process up. It took about 3 or 4 minutes to get done. So now we have album 1 here with its tracks. And album 2 here, previously transferred. Anyway, enter DJ mode, and you've got 2 decks, like I mentioned, left and right, and you need to choose a track for each channel. Let's go for track 1 for this, and then choose channel 2. Let's go for track 2. And you've got control over levels over here, 1 and 2, track 1 and 2. So I can start with track 1. You've got a Q mix, by the way. So a different mix out the headphones if you want to listen to a track before you get it to play. And then remember, these backlit buttons tell you what each pad does. So this is play for track 1. And you can bend briefly or just pitch it down or up. And when I'm ready for the other track to come in, just hit play. And then I'm not a DJ, but you get the idea. You can sync the tracks to each other so they'll tempo match, assuming tempo detection is right. If not, you could set it manually. And those are the basics of DJ mode. So that's pretty much it for the SP. Another important aspect of it is the extremely useful companion software. It works kind of like an extended screen for quite a few aspects of the SP, like editing samples. So if I get out of DJ mode, you get a display of all the pads that are full, the samples on each pad. You can swap projects really easily. Let's go into my Superbooth sample pack. So as you change banks and play the different samples, they'll update on screen as well. So not that they needed trimming, but if they did, you could do that here too. It's pretty easy to do it here as well. So there's no need for the software in that respect. But some things maybe are faster here, like maybe going through a lot of pads and normalizing them. And then there are a few settings here where it's nice to get an overview of all the values, say, of bank tempos and levels. Not a must, but certainly for transferring samples back and forth, super easy and really convenient. Before we head out to the tips and tricks section, just a quick look at the settings to make sure I didn't miss anything. Bunch of nice things you can control here. It would be nice, by the way, there's a direct mode for the knobs and a catch-up, so you need to find the parameter and catch it. It would be nice if there was a relative proportional catch-up mode. You can configure the sub-pad to do skip back if you want, and a bunch of options here. Edit the click, which is the metronome, and we're on version 1.1, so all my complaints are only relevant for this one. Let's go into pad settings, set the threshold, and a few other parameters here. I particularly liked the fact that you can change the bus color, and if we go into effects settings, we covered most of this. Just one thing I wanted to mention here is that this is where you customize what these buttons do. So you can choose any one of the effects to assign it a shortcut instead of what the factory defaults are. So that's the tutorial part. Let's talk about a few tips, tricks, and ideas. The first is that while the SP-404 MK2 is fairly straightforward to use and easy, things are labeled for the most part. A few things aren't. I mentioned this earlier. Don't forget that some of the effects have 2 pages, which you can access using the value button, and the remain button will keep an effect on screen and not make it go away after a few seconds. A few other good, useful ones. Shift bank lets you set the relative volume for a bank. I gotta exit first, but yeah, set it like that, which is very useful if you have different things going on in different banks. Shift gate will change the gate status for an entire bank. Also useful if you've just imported a bunch of samples. Copy plus exit lets you copy entire banks. Obviously the copy button, I didn't talk about that, copies buttons, and exchange will exchange or swap out pads. And one more obscure thing is that the value push encoder sometimes acts as a shift. So for example, you can turn effects on or off like this, but you can turn an effect on temporarily by holding the value encoder. Then leaving this will turn the effect off. And then another useful one, let's say you triggered a sample, you went and did whatever with another sample. Now you want to edit this again without re-triggering it. So just hold this and you can choose the sample and then edit it while it's still running. So yeah, nice one there. Next trick that I found particularly useful, like I mentioned earlier, you can play a piano or any sample chromatically just by entering chromatic mode, adjusting the start point, and playing the sample up and down. This has a few disadvantages. First thing, as you pitch a sample up, it gets more chipmunky and doesn't sound like a piano anymore. And second disadvantage of this mode is that it's monophonic, so a sample will cut out the old sample, and there are no scales here, at least as of the current firmware. So a way to solve all these issues is just to sample a different note per pad. This makes the whole thing polyphonic. You can play chords, and you can also arrange the pads in a scale, as opposed to chromatically. Now this is actually way easier than you might think. Just hook this up to a computer, iPad, or just a real audio source. Sample a scale patiently. Just sample every note. Let it die down. And so on. You get a long sample with multiple notes. Go into chop mode. We already talked about this. Chop it by transient and just assign it to pads, and you can get a polyphonic instrument in your scale of choice really easily. Next tip, get a bunch of ambient soundscape samples, download them into a bank, and yeah, just get them to loop. Streams play in the background, birds chirping, anything you want. These will just run as you play whatever you want alongside. There's plenty of polyphony here, and you can even run your tracks with the ambience going on in the background, and exit each of the loops if you want, or just tap this 4 times. Next tip is that resample is your friend, both for individual sounds and for loops. So like I mentioned earlier, the effects are global. If you have a particular chain of effects going that makes your pads or loops sound great, simply resample that and hold that as a loop. Then you're free of remembering to assign these effects again next time you go back into the bank or the project. Another reason to use the resample option for sequences, like I mentioned, currently the pattern sequencer doesn't support anything but a 4/4 meter. This song is actually in 6/8. So it's not something you can sequence with a sequencer. I had to play this in live or sample it from my track. Then another reason to resample loops is that unlike the pattern sequencer, which lets you play just one pattern at a time, here you can play multiple patterns. So, I've got this going and the bass pattern going, and just trigger them together and they play alongside each other. This also lets you merge loops by resampling them together. So I've got this hi-hat loop and this loop, and then just hit resample, play them together, and resample that. Or if you want, alternatively, just pad link them. So hit pad link and then link these two together, and now they'll just trigger together. Now there is a challenge with setting loop lengths properly, otherwise over time they'll grow out of phase with each other. Again, either resample these two loops or maybe use the pattern sequencer to trigger these loops, so that will keep them in time by re-triggering a loop every few bars. Another neat trick, if you want to move from pattern to pattern and immediately swap the two, just put them in a mute group, in a choke group, and you can easily swap resampled patterns just like you swap patterns in the pattern sequencer. You do need to get your timing right, but if you don't, well, it's lo-fi. Next little tip, if you want to play guitar or sing over a loop that's playing, if you hit resample mode, remember to go to the record settings and choose external input in the routing. This way, anything you play on the SP won't be resampled, but anything coming in through the inputs will. Moving on to the last one, the 404 Mark II doesn't have a built-in synth, but single cycle shenanigans are allowed here. So if you grab a sample, go into start and end, and just start trimming that down with it essentially becomes an oscillator. So once you have an oscillator, you'll certainly want to filter it. And yeah, effects couldn't hurt. And you can also play it chromatically. So I'm not saying you should throw away all your synths and unsubscribe from this channel, but you can have a bit of fun with this, maybe resample it. Obviously, the SP-404 Mark II isn't intended for this, but you might get a few interesting or curious sounds that you could use in your projects. Okay, having covered all that, let's talk about alternatives, pros, and cons. And it really depends what you compare it to. If you compare this to the original SP-404 variants, the MK2 excels in so many ways, it's a no-brainer. There's a high-res screen to help you chop samples and see much more information, more pads, more voices, envelopes, skip back, DJ mode, more effects and buses. The pads are velocity sensitive, and all these improvements were added without increasing the price, without complicating the workflow too much. If you've used an old SP, you'll find yourself right at home here and relieved to have many of your wishes granted. What about other competitors? Is the SP-404 Mark II an MPC killer or a circuit rhythm or Digitact killer? I don't think so. I think it's its own unique thing. On the cons side, if I had to name the top 4 features that are missing here, which hopefully should be something that can be added in a future firmware update, it's 1, a proper step sequencer with hopefully automation and more flexibility with meter and length settings. Number 2, polyphony and scales for playing samples melodically, not just a monophonic chromatic option. Number 3 at the top of my list is the ability to assign effects to be saved alongside banks and projects as opposed to just one single set of global effects. And then number 4 you should be aware of, there's no undo option except the one in the sequencer. It's kind of nice that you don't need to save anything, everything is automatically saved, but if you delete a sample, there's no way back, so make sure to back up projects to a computer or to the SD card and protect pads that you don't want to be changed. Aside from that, I have a list of more minor things I'd love to see added in firmware updates. Rather than read them out to you, I'll just list them on the screen now, and if enough people agree, hopefully Roland will take care of these in future firmware updates. Where the SP-404 Mark II shines in comparison to other samplers isn't a long list of features on a checklist, but rather the ease of use, portability, and the ability to take pretty much any size sample you want to throw at it, all packed in a very tight form factor. The focus here is just to make it easy, immediate, give you a lot of fun effects, maybe a DJ mode to get your tracks going. So the SP-404 Mark II might not do everything, especially on the sequencing side, but this particular combination of effects, form factor, and particular feature set is a lot of fun to use. It's kind of like a portable party. So that's it for the SP-404 Mark II. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.